Thank you for joining today's national meeting session. My name is Carrie Shelton, and I am the TTA Project Manager for BJA's Body-Worn Camera Policy and Implementation Program. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few helpful tips for this session. As a reminder, please keep your phones or your computer audio on mute to avoid background noise. To do that, just look at the bottom black bar of your Zoom window and hit the microphone screen. This session is recorded so that others may view it later on using our website. During the session, if you'd like to ask a question of the panelists, please use the chat function and direct your questions to the host. You can send a question at any time throughout the session. You don't have to wait till the end. And to access the chat function, if you're on a computer, it's located at the bottom center of your screen in that black bar. And if you're using a mobile device, your chat function is in the top right corner of your screen. So that we know who all is participating in the meeting, especially if it's required for your grant, it's a grant requirement, please edit your display name by hovering over your name, clicking More, choosing the rename option, and changing your screen name to reflect your full name, title, and agency. After the session, there will be an opportunity to evaluate it through the session page in the conference application. Please select the Rate Session button to provide us your input on this session and help us improve for future events. As a reminder, points of view or opinions expressed herein do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you all again for your participation. If you have any technical issues during this session or throughout the meeting, please reach out to us via the chat function or email bwctta@cna.org. And now we will begin our second session of the day. Searching for answers. What are the effects of body-worn cameras on police behavior? We are joined by Dr. Craig Uchida, who is the President of Justice and Security Strategies and a Senior Advisor for Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance. We are also joined by Dr. Ali Malm, who is also a subject matter expert on body-worn camera TTA and a professor at California State University, Long Beach, We're also joined by one of our other senior advisors from the Body-Worn Camera Training and Technical Assistance Program, Tom Woodmansey, who is a retired lieutenant. With that, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screens and pass it off to Dr. Uchida.
Great, great, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Craig Uchida. As Carrie mentioned, I'm the president of JSS, and we do research and evaluations. We also are assisting with the BWC TTA contract. Today, we're going to talk about finding answers and getting answers, we hope, to your questions that come from research primarily. I think I've heard yesterday and today a number of questions about citizens' perceptions, officer perceptions, other types of things. And so we hope to answer some of those through research and give you an idea of what is out there with respect to research. This will also be a little different in terms of the way we will ask you questions. We're going to have pop-up questions at various times during the presentations. So I hope that you will, in fact, participate in that so that we will know what your thinking is and be able to address some of the issues that do arise. So if you do get a pop-up, please answer those questions, and we just want to see what you all think about certain things. Next slide, please. So I have with me today Dr. Ali Malm. She is a professor at Cal State Long Beach. She's done extensive research on body-worn cameras, has done experiments, and has recently published a book, and I'll let her give you the title of that book later. We're also joined by Lieutenant Tom Woodmansey. Tom was a lieutenant in the Madison Police Department in Wisconsin. He's currently a senior advisor with CNA, works with a number of you on your body-worn camera grants, and has done so for about the last 5 years. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do, I'm just going to give you some background about body-worn cameras and research. We'll raise certain research questions. I'll give some findings, and Dr. Malm will do the same, especially with respect to experiments. And then Tom will provide, I think, some useful information about how to use the findings in the field, how and in what way it can help you, and how it's been used by current grantees and former grantees as well. And then we hope to have some discussions, and we'll have questions, and hopefully you will send us questions too. So if you do that through the chat room, that would be great, and we'll be able to address those as well. Next slide. So just in terms of background, body-worn cameras, as you all know, have just exploded in terms of their popularity with police agencies across the country, and it is probably the most implemented technology in policing to date. And at the same time, the research on all of these police departments that have implemented cameras has also exploded. I think it's unprecedented, frankly, that we have so many studies that have gone on over the last 5 years, and we have results from those studies, which is also pretty rare. Usually it takes a long time for findings to get out there, but researchers have been very quick on getting publications out and getting documents out so that we know what's going on and how those cameras are affecting people. The issues that have arisen deal with things like accountability, with transparency, with citizen confidence, with legitimacy, with procedural justice, and other types of behaviors by police. Next slide, please. So what are some of the questions that have been addressed? Among the most important, frankly, are what's the effect on body-worn cameras on police and citizens? What do they think? What do they feel? But also, what's been the effect on police behavior? A second question is about officer safety. How do cameras affect that safety? How do cameras affect procedural justice? And importantly, too, how do they influence the use of force and citizen complaints? Next slide, please. Here's one of our pop-up questions. And part of what we're looking at here are citizen attitudes. And part of what we found is that there are 16 studies that actually have used surveys. And they've been national and they've been local. The local ones get at more precise answers about perceptions. The national ones just look very broadly at what people think about cameras and whether there's support or not, and whether police agencies should require the use of cameras. Next slide. In local surveys, so I'm just going to give you this one example of a survey that was done in Florida. And 2 counties were actually questioned about all this. And part of what happened was that people said that 87% of the time they thought that cameras would improve officer behavior. 80% believe that body-worn cameras would improve residents' behavior, and nearly 89% believe that body-worn cameras would assist in collecting evidence. 78% believe that body-worn cameras would also increase police legitimacy. In the polling that we just did, we asked, does your community support police officers wearing body-worn cameras? And all of your answers, all of you said that yes, the community does support the wearing of cameras. Our next question is about, do your officers support wearing body-worn cameras? And I'm very curious about what your thinking is here. Go to the next slide. I'll talk more about what findings are from the research. There have been 32 studies that have actually looked at officer attitudes towards body-worn cameras, and the findings, for the most part, have been positive in terms of officers wearing cameras. One of the things that does come out, however, is that initially, when officers are asked prior to cameras being implemented, there's a lot of skepticism, and I think we heard that yesterday also with the panel on voices from the field. That I know in Park City and Colorado Springs, the chiefs there said that, yeah, the officers were skeptical and were wondering whether and what these were all about. And that's what a lot of the research has found as well, that it does take some time for officers to accept the cameras and to use them appropriately. The studies that have been done are what we call panel studies, where officers are interviewed or questioned or fill out a survey at 2 or 3 different occasions. And in LA, we did this, and we did find in one division in Los Angeles that officers supported them and increased their support over time. But interestingly enough, too, we found that in another division, while they had initial support for them, after about a year, there was a decrease in support. And that was also similar to findings in Phoenix, where over time, there was also some skepticism and continued to be. And in part, it's because of the belief that the cameras and the footage may have been punitive, that it may also have increased their workload. And so there was that negative view. Overall, however, I think we found that police officers are more in favor of them because of the way in which complaints have been handled, that frivolous complaints are less likely to occur. And then in some jurisdictions, complaints are dealt with much more quickly than they have been in the past. And as a result, I think there has been then more support for them. One of the things we just saw in the survey here was that of all of you, only 2 out of the audience said that officers don't support them. So about 8% said that there was no support, or at least there was less support, and the rest of you said, yeah, they do support. Next slide, please. So officer safety, this question was raised in the last session. And there's, as Mike White had indicated, there's only one study that's looked at this issue, whether officers are safer with body-worn cameras or not. And only one study looked at this, and the findings were counterintuitive. That is, researchers found that officers, when they used discretion to activate the cameras, found that use of force had increased rather than decreased. They thought that the activation of the camera really increased the tension and increased in aggression between citizens and officers. We tried to look at this in LA, and I think as Dr. White also indicated, part of the problem is that the number of assaults on police is not as high as one would think. That in Los Angeles, with 10,000 officers, we found that on a monthly basis, there were maybe a dozen to 15 assaults on police, and even that's high during a month. And so we couldn't really discern whether there was a change over time with respect to an increase or decrease in officer safety, because the numbers were so low with respect to those types of events. Next slide, please. Lastly, I want to talk about procedural justice. And procedural justice, as you all know, has become a very major issue across the country. And The concern here is for how police and the public interact, and do body-worn cameras affect that interaction? What we looked at were officer behavior directly. That is, we directly observed officers, rode with officers, and tried to measure what they did during their encounters. We were looking in particular for different aspects of procedural justice. Did officers, for example, allow for participation by the people they talked to? Were they unbiased and neutral in how they addressed people? Basically, were they fair, thoughtful? Did they act more trustworthy? Did they give people dignity and respect? And what we did here was we rode with officers in different divisions over a 2 to 4 week period. We randomly selected the officers for the ride-alongs so that there wasn't a bias of sergeants selecting particular officers or not, who would be more favorable to us. We rode with whoever popped up on our list, and they agreed and did agree to ride with us and allow us to observe them. And we observed about 330 encounters before cameras were implemented, and over 220 encounters after they were implemented. Next slide, please. What we found was that there was significant and positive increases in most of the characteristics of procedural justice. That there was an increase in participation, neutrality, dignity, and respect, and overall procedural justice. We didn't see a significant effect on trustworthiness, but nonetheless, overall, we found an increase of 10% in procedural justice, which was a statistically significant increase. One of the things I might also add here is that in the study, during the first wave of our observations, the level of procedural justice was particularly high. And I was afraid that any impact by body-worn cameras would not occur, that because it was so high, I thought, okay, can it get higher? And in fact, it did. And so there was an effect. I think it did increase procedural justice, and therefore the cameras do make a difference in that respect. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Dr. Ali Mom. As I mentioned, she's done a number of studies on body-worn cameras, particularly experiments. And so Ali, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Craig. Next slide, please. So as Craig mentioned, there's been an explosion in body-worn camera studies. We went from 5 back in 2014 all the way up to 70 plus. It was 70 last year. I'm sure it's 80 or 90 this year. And what I'm going to do today is talk about the gold standard of that research. So as researchers, there's different levels of rigorousness in what we do, and experiments are the highest. They're the ones that we put a lot of stock into. And what I mean when I say experiments is that basically it rests on being randomly assigned. So these studies randomly assign officers to either wearing a body-worn camera or not. And what that allows us to see is that, does the body-worn camera make a difference in all of these outcomes that I'm going to talk about, rather than other elements, other factors that could come in? That random assignment allows us to say that. There's also right underneath the gold standard of experiments, something called quasi-experiments. I'm not going to bore you with the details there, but those are really good studies too, where we try to match up the people that are wearing body-worn cameras, the officers that are wearing, to officers that aren't wearing, based on some of their other factors like length of service, gender, age, ethnicity, and so on, so that we can get a really good matched basis of officers wearing cameras and not. Astoundingly, there's been about 15 randomized controlled trials and 10 quasi-experiments of body-worn cameras. That's 25 of these gold and silver standard studies. And that's amazing when we look at one aspect of policing research. We don't get that type of body of research very often in criminology or in the social sciences because they're expensive and time-consuming studies to run. But we've got them here. The majority have been in larger departments with 500 or more sworn officers, but that doesn't mean we haven't had these high-level, really rigorous studies in smaller, mid-sized departments either. The first one was in Rialto, California, and the positive results from that study really helped ignite the body-worn camera fervor and the rest of the research that was done in this area. Spokane, Washington, Tempe, Arizona, Mike White, who you heard speak earlier, ran those 2 RCTs. Anaheim, California, I ran a study in Anaheim, California using randomized controlled trial experiment, and also Hallandale Beach, Florida. All these departments having under 300 sworn officers. So we have seen them in large and mid-sized departments. What I'm going to do quickly is go over the results of these really rigorous, really great studies in 4 different outcome areas: complaints, use of force, how they've affected criminal investigations, and also how body-worn cameras affect officer activities. Next slide, please. All right, but what you're going to find astounding, and Mike White sort of foreshadowed this earlier today as well, is that we have 18,000 different police departments in this country. And we're not going to have 18,000 different stories, but we're certainly not just going to have one either. There's very different stories, and the results from these experiments tell different stories too. Contrast what we found in Rialto, where the chief came out and had really, really positive results. This is from a press story around the time that the results were released. When you put a camera on a police officer, they behave a little better, they follow the rules a little better, and their results supported this statement. And then when the DC study came out, it showed very little effect in all of the outcomes, actually no effect in the outcomes that they were measuring. And they suggested that maybe we'd better reconsider our expectations when it came to how body-worn cameras might affect some of these different outcomes. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, and there's our first pop-up, so if you could answer that and I'll go over the results. As I mentioned, I'm going to go over 4 different outcomes, and this has been mentioned earlier today as well. There have been 26 studies. The vast majority of these have been in high-level RCTs, or those experiments or quasi-experiments that have shown a reduction of complaint against officers. So 20 of the 26 studies show a reduction. That's not unanimous, but it's certainly compelling. And we see this to be the case in small and mid-sized departments as well. And I know that that's where many of you are coming from, are these smaller and mid-sized departments. So even those have shown reductions in complaints. Next slide, please. In use of force, and here we go with the results. And look at that, that's about where we were seeing with the, maybe a little higher than what we've seen in the studies, but about 93% of you think that the body-worn cameras are causing a reduction in complaints. Very compelling. Let's look at our second outcome. This is use of force. We've had 19 rigorous studies show a reduction, and 11 of those have shown a reduction in use of force. This is officer use of force. This is statistically significant or substantial reductions in use of force in the departments. And once again, just like in complaints, we've seen small and mid-sized departments show a reduction in use of force as well. And there's our second pop-up. Now, why aren't we seeing all of the complaints and all of the use of force going down in each of these studies? Well, there could be a number of reasons. I'll talk more about many of the reasons at the end of my presentation, but think about this. You could have, a department could start with fairly low levels of complaints to begin with. Or alternatively, there could be different activation rates and different compliance with policy in different studies as well in some of these different sites. So there's many reasons that we would be seeing these different stories in different studies. Next slide, please. All right, the third outcome area that I want to talk about is criminal investigations. And while there's been less studies, there's only been 7 of these really rigorous studies looking at the effect of body-worn cameras on criminal investigations. 5 of them have shown positive results. Again, very compelling evidence here. The rate of prosecutions with body-worn camera evidence have gone up. The time to disposition when we use body-worn camera footage has gone down. When we talk about guilty pleas have gone up, these studies show. So this is very compelling positive evidence, once again, that body-worn cameras are having a positive effect in police departments. And here's our second poll. Do you think body-worn cameras are useful in reducing use of force? A little bit less unanimous here, where we get 78% of you saying yes and 22% of you saying no. I love how these poll results are mirroring what our experiments have shown us, where complaints tend to be the most compelling body of evidence, but use of force are followed behind. Next slide, please. All right, the most mixed outcome area that I'm talking about today is in officer activity. And when we think about that, maybe that's not that surprising. We've had 12 studies that have looked at the activity of arrests and how body-worn camera affects officer arrest rates. And 5 of these studies show a reduction in arrest rates. 3 of them show an increase, and the remaining didn't show any effect at all. So very, very mixed. When we talk about citations, we've only had 3 studies measure citations. 2 show an increase in citation, and 1 showed a decrease in citations. The only really overwhelming body of evidence we have when we talk about officer activity is in this idea of depolicing. So have officers pulled back from proactive policing? Have they stopped enforcing? And we have absolutely no support in the research that this has been the case. Next slide, please. So why the mixed results? I'm sure that's what you're all thinking. We've had all these great studies that are very, very rigorous. We have a huge body of them now. Why aren't we telling the same stories? And as I mentioned in the beginning, that's telling the same story just it's not realistic for us to expect. Every type of research is going to show mixed results, even the most rigorous research. And even when we look at some really proven techniques in policing, such as hotspot policing and the like, we still get mixed results. Why is that? It's all about context. Those of you who've worked in different departments, or I'm sure when you work outside of your department, you talk to officers from different departments have different culture. They might have different body-worn camera policy. You might have different activation levels in these departments. The goal of the body-worn camera program might be different. If you set up a program and the overall goal is to use the body-worn camera footage as evidence collection in one department, but the goal of another department was to increase accountability and transparency to the community, you might have very, very different outcome levels in complaints, use of force, whether you are having different officer activity and the like. So all of these things can contribute to the mixed results. But what is the take home of, I think, what Mike was saying earlier, what Dr. Uchida is saying now, and what I'm saying is that the results are en masse overwhelmingly positive. We really haven't seen research come out that has been replicated in more than one study having a negative result of body-worn cameras. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Tom, who's going to talk about how you can take this research, or how police departments have taken some of this research and used it in their own context, in their own cities.
Great, thank you, Dr. Malm. I'm really pleased to be part of this. I wanted to start off by saying, so thank you for joining this session, and I'm really happy to be teamed with Dr. Uchida and Dr. Malm. You'll see a couple poll questions pop up as we go on, as we've seen already, and we'll address those. First one is, has your agency ever utilized a research partner, university or consultant or independent researcher? So in any capacity whatsoever, we're just curious. So as a retired police officer and one of the body-worn camera team members, I do quite a bit of networking with police around the country. And I wanted to start off with some comments on some perspectives that I've heard from discussions with officers relating to body-worn camera. And involving research that focuses on policing practices. Now, these aren't meant to be reflective of all police beliefs, but just some random opinions and thoughts I've heard. So I'll start off with the body-worn camera. Nothing new that to the audience probably hasn't witnessed themselves, but a perception that body-worn camera has received so much attention because the public demand and the primary purpose is to provide oversight on the police, with many people believing that there's something wrong and body-worn cameras will fix the problems. We've heard that perception. So poll results there, as you can see, speak for themselves. A good chunk, not surprising, haven't. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. One of the earlier slides that was provided noted body-worn cameras can provide accountability, transparency, and citizen confidence. And all these things are good for police to have, but they are really more about external perceptions. Again, with the tone of oversight to correct something that is broken. And I think police continue to try and see that body-worn camera is more than just that, but the public, I think, largely, and I'm speaking in generalizations, view that as what the purpose is. So fair or unfair, this is a reality that police are dealing with when it relates to community perceptions. It's okay. But I believe overwhelmingly that police welcome any insights on how to improve their jobs. But I also believe that with anyone in any job that they have, the police want it to make sense and they want it to be part of the decision-making that affects them when at all possible. So in general, from what I see, I don't feel at all that police believe that they have anything to hide. And they want to demonstrate what they do is good for the agency, and the agency should utilize body-worn camera technology to demonstrate the good work that's being done by the agency for the community. My point is that I believe and hope that more and more officers and agencies are recognizing the benefits that the body-worn camera provides to our industry. And I think that you've seen with the research that was highlighted already that that is the case. So I really like to look at how body-worn camera can help the police do a better job, and having us to try and highlight that during this discussion. Because we all know it's way more than just a technology. It's not like getting a new radio or even a new rifle implemented. When you look at the totality of impacts that body-worn camera can have on our industry, it really is easy to embrace. But sometimes that messaging is hard to convey to officers, but it impacts potentially officer safety, community safety. It can assist with training from tactics to professional communications. As Craig noted, evidentiary values, transparency, a word that's used a lot, but it makes sense and it's important and we need to embrace that. The positive impacts on complaints that Dr. Malm talked about, but both officer and citizen accountability as well. And some things that go unnoticed that I think is important to note from my perspective is that really body-worn camera can provide an opportunity for police to proactively display all the good work that's being done that might otherwise go unnoticed. So Dr. Uchida noted that the police are more and more accepting of body-worn camera and recognize the benefits of having them. And I continue to believe that we are hearing this more and more, and especially in this meeting. So secondly, I want to touch on with this slide a point on research and just some perspectives. So you can get some funny reactions when you ask police what they think about research. And there's a poll question. Some of what I've heard, and I'm paraphrasing, is there are certainly police that are not against research, but they want to feel that it has to relate to their practices. So something like, researchers don't always tend to understand what it is like out there. They don't walk in our shoes. They observe and study in a laboratory. I'm all for research, but it has to be more about for my job as a police officer and not for the job of the researcher. Other comments I've heard are studies and outcomes. Tell me something that I don't know already. All this work went into the findings and recommendations for the police, but sometimes police view them as, well, this isn't really all that new. I've heard this before. Tell me something that I didn't know, and I could have saved you a lot of time and money without doing a study on this. So look at that result. That's pretty consistent.
It's half and half. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, for sure, Craig. And please, Craig, chime in anytime on any of these results.
Oh, no, that's fine.
So it was noted earlier that I think Eileen mentioned that, you know, currently over 90 studies have been conducted to evaluate body-worn camera. And I think some police are like, well, if you need 90 studies, you must not be getting it right to start with. So that seems a little unusual. But what we're finding is that it's important that we recognize that the studies and the outcomes vary, as Dr. Malm pointed out, for different reasons. With all the agencies and the police in our country right now, they are going to vary. So one study that was noted is, and from my understanding, about the use of assaults increasing with body-worn camera based upon having the camera present. And from what I know, and I might be wrong in this, but I believe I'm correct, that study included verbal assaults, quote, verbal assaults in the same category as physical assaults. So I believe the study was done somewhere else in the world. Now, I don't know if everyone in this meeting would ever define a verbal assault as a physical assault from your experiences. I certainly wouldn't, based upon the police work I've been involved with. Verbal assaults are just going to be there. But my point is that the definitions vary, and it matters with police on legitimacy of these definitions and interpretations. I do believe that police overwhelmingly welcome research, especially on body-worn camera, to help their entire approach with their body-worn camera programs, because police are very much about evidence-based. And that's what research demonstrates with body-worn camera, even if some of the research ends up being fairly obvious or consistent with what people thought it would be to start with. I do believe that we as an industry in policing could better utilize research, whether it's your own internal research within your organization, your department, or tapping into external studies that have already been done. I would say, you know, how many of us have seen in our industry, even when something's working well, there'll come along a new strategy or innovation, a new idea in policing practices that's the latest and greatest trend, only to learn that it ended up being basically something that was tried in the past in one form or another. So research can help police to not repeat what hasn't worked as well in the past, and more importantly, to promote and validate and sustain what actually does work. So as Dr. Malm mentioned, the 18,000 police agencies in the country, I just think, how are we really able to demonstrate and promote best practices and consistency and accountability with so many different agencies? I imagine most of you in the audience have surrounding jurisdictions that are doing policing practices, and the quality of work varies differently. It's just normal for this to occur. So it's difficult with our industry in that you can create such challenges when we all get lumped together. Something bad can happen on one coast and it affects the other coast in our policing culture. We see this weekly, if not daily. And it's just the reality of today's policing. But really, research and body-worn camera can both help police to demonstrate what and why and how they do things based on evidence and fact. So let me go to some examples. And I'll just touch on these quickly. So relating to body-worn camera notification, some of the studies. One study assessed the perceptions of body-worn camera after encounters with police. It looked at how behaviors may or may not have changed. What I found interesting is less than a third of the people that were contacted by the police were even aware that the cameras were present. So the research didn't find necessarily an overwhelming calming effect, but it did change behaviors. And this can be important for when police develop their policies on notifications. We've already touched on some of the impacts of procedural justice. Craig mentioned that. What I found interesting is that one study showed that 80% of the respondents, of the citizens, strongly agreed that the officers acted professionally during their contact, and more than 80% believe the officers were honest This is external information that sheds a positive light on the police and that we can push out to communities that doesn't come from our messaging, but comes from an independent study. I think throughout this meeting, we've heard examples already in just day 2 of complaint resolutions. And I've talked to several agencies, internal affairs divisions, where they've really utilized their body-worn cameras to address complaints right up front by viewing it, by resolving it. If there isn't anything founded, they'll invite citizens to come in, look at the footage, explain to them that there isn't a policy violation, even though it sometimes will be refuted by the citizens watching what they've seen. What I see with this is that this goes really greatly to the health and wellness of officers. Having been the subject of internal affairs investigations in my career, it's very, very stressful, founded or unfounded. Mine were unfounded, thankfully, but it isn't easy. And if body-worn camera can help with that, I think it's fantastic. So when I was lieutenant of our training division and academy for a period of time, and really body-worn camera, I think, is an outstanding opportunity to reinforce good communication skills, good tactics, and good safety. We know that one sheriff's office used internal research from their body-worn camera systems to determine if officers were speeding and having a problem with that, because they had a car crash every month on average. And as a result of the accidents, the officers were filing complaints or claims, and also, more importantly, being injured. So they utilized their internal research to establish a training program to address these accidents through the video, and they ultimately got it down to 0, no accidents for 3 years. So we've heard of agencies utilizing their body-worn camera footage for pre-service and in-service, and to highlight good behavior, not just what you shouldn't do. Just to touch on, I don't want to dive too deep into the Las Vegas study that was conducted with CNA. That was really a cost-benefit outcome that was pretty impressive. They realized a $4.2 million savings in investigative time, and it really helped to validate the investment financially of having body-worn cameras. I spoke to one of the captains from Dan Zender from the agency, who said that from Las Vegas, a lot of police base some of their policies around this research, since they could show that it worked somewhere else. Their training guide has been used by other agencies on body-worn camera implementation. So it also demonstrated some important information on storage. And just 2 other comments quickly. Community outreach. This is one thing that we've heard from over the years with our TTA program from many officers, supervisors, and especially chiefs. Had I known now what I knew, had I known what I know now at the time we implemented our body-worn camera program, I would have put a lot more emphasis on educating the community on what it is, what our goals were, what our limitations are, and also so everybody can have some reasonable expectations about body-worn camera. It's not going to fix everything. So you're not going to get every piece of footage when it comes in. So the chiefs I spoke to said that it saved a lot of time and complaints and on the front end of doing community outreach by establishing these reasonable expectations. So this is something I view as ongoing. So everybody listening now, I think if you've got a good, robust community outreach program, continue it. And then report writing, Dr. Malm told me about we put the link up here, a report from Philadelphia, a study that showed that there were some various opinions about whether officers should view camera footage before report writing. And I'm talking in general, all incidents, not just significant ones. So what the research found was that the officers' accuracy improved in the reports, that basic, which is to me fairly obvious it should, but there's documentation. And from my perspective, this is no doubt helped in courtroom testimony. So I'll wrap up with 2 final slides for the group. And I just am gonna throw these up, and these are just some comments from the field that I've heard in preparation for this discussion. So read them on your own as I wrap up with some final thoughts. And just want to note from a colleague who told me that, for agencies don't always consider research as formal studies. He said, I think this can be a mistake. When we think of research, we think of random controlled trials, quasi-experiments that we've heard about, and that must be done by researchers. But important information related to your body-worn camera program can also be done by you within your agency in non-formal research. So current subject matter expert and former Chief Scott Hogue told me this, and I put it in quotes: we should not get caught up in the definition of research versus review. When you hear the word research, there's a tendency to think larger than necessary. Research can be as simple as conducting video reviews and using the research to flesh out problems lying in wait with individual agencies. So I think that's a really important point. And Chief Hogg made mention of where they use their internal research to study their wearing their traffic vest while directing traffic, which side to approach on tactical approaches with vehicles, and then proper officer response for calls to service with officers waiting for backup. So let's transition to the last slide and have you read those comments. And I'll just wrap up now and say that I believe most everyone in the audience probably has, in one form or another, utilized research, whether you may know it or not. I saw that the poll shows that no formal research was done. I would just promote that you continue to utilize it to help you and look for various opportunities that could provide you with some significant opportunities to impact your agency and educate the community as well. We've got 2 nationally renowned researchers on this panel, but we also have a variety of other subject matter experts that are researchers with this program. We can help you if you need it. When we look at everything that research can go to help you, from safety to training to budget justifications, it's hard to ignore. I would also support that you consider looking at enlisting a local university to help you study your body-worn camera program if you want to better understand the impacts and effectiveness, even if you're underway with it. So when I was a police officer, I used to think that I understood and valued research to help me with my job. But now that I work with CNA, for CNA, and we do research with police over the country, I wish I would have known then what I know now and how it can really help me and better my agency. So I appreciate this opportunity, and I'm going to turn it all back to Craig now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom and Eiley. This slide gives you the links to different outcomes related to use of force, civilian complaints, and officer activity. As you all know too, we'll be providing you with all of these slides. And so you'll be able to click on to these links and to get access to the documents. And as Tom mentioned, I think there is a lot of technical assistance that we can provide to you. We can direct you to different things. We can also assist you directly either by phone or email. We're not traveling yet because of COVID, but we can certainly help you with different questions that you have and different issues you may have. We do have some questions from the audience as well as internal ones, and I'm going to try to read some of them, and hopefully we can discuss some of them too. One of the questions that has emerged too is about context, and one of the, I think, major questions about all these findings is, so it's confusing, it's a little daunting to try to determine which research to follow and which ones not to follow and things of that nature. So Eiley, if you could talk a little bit more about context in terms of the difficulties perhaps of taking a particular finding and running with it, and one of them does relate to the issue about officer safety, and because there's only one study, it's okay, should we accept that? Should we follow that? Should we not give officers discretion to turn on their cameras then? What do you think of that? And if you could just quickly address that part of the context, that would be great.
Sure, Craig. And it's a really important question because as practitioners, you might be confronted in the media as well with big studies that have taken a hold. We've mentioned the DC study a number of times, but there have been other studies that have followed up that have shown, either a no significant result at all, or like Craig mentioned, this negative result with officers' safety. And what I would suggest that you do is look for, first of all, contact someone that might be able to help. Contact one of us, contact a researcher that you know that can help you wade through the masses of data. But also, when it comes to context, look for research that's been done in departments that are most like yours. Look for something in terms of size. If you're from a smaller mid-sized department, look for research in those smaller mid-sized departments, or look for media reports on those types of studies. If you're in a large department that really has very low, the LAPD is a good example of this, Craig, where there was good procedural justice to begin with, low complaints, low use of force to begin with. We have to understand that you're going to have less of an effect in that type of department than you will in a department like Rialto that had a bunch of problems prior to having body-worn cameras. So as a practitioner, as a consumer of this research, look for studies in departments that are most like you. And you're going to find them. With a body of research of 90, you're going to find them. Also, think about what I was mentioning in terms of rigor. These outcome directories that you see on your screen, they actually rate rigor in a really easy, and by rigor, I mean quality of work. They rate the quality of the study on a 1 to 5 scale. 5s are the best, 1s are the worst. Put more stock in those 5s than you would in the 1s, because the 5s have had much more really care taken to separate out the body-worn camera group from the group that wasn't wearing body-worn cameras.
Terrific. Thanks, Eiley. Tom, any comments about context? Anything you want to add to that?
No, that was great, Craig. I know you have other questions, so I have nothing significant to add to that. Okay.
There are some questions that have come up from the audience. The more recent one is this one's interesting. As the public has become more aware of body-worn cameras, has there been a pushback by segments of the public in demanding that cameras be turned off? How about that one, folks? What do you think? Have you heard or seen any pushback by the public about demanding that cameras be turned off? Anything along those lines?
It's a really interesting question, and it makes sense too why the question would be asked. I'm going to go back to some of the studies that we've seen, and I did 2 of them where we asked people. We actually called up individuals who had come into contact with the police and asked them, was the officer wearing a camera? And we've had other researchers do this too. And you'd be amazed that the vast majority, like over 90% of the individuals, had no idea. They might guess, and sometimes they guess incorrectly because some of our officers weren't wearing cameras and some were. So first off, to answer the question, there's just not an ignorance, but there is an unawareness. Quite often, people just aren't aware that the officer, and the majority of citizens aren't aware that the officer is wearing a camera. I haven't seen any research, and I haven't heard from the field either of a pushback of citizens asking officers to turn the camera off or not, but Tom might have a different perspective on that.
Well, no, I don't think we've heard a ton of that, but it does come up. And the interesting part is that some police agencies are curious as to what do we do with it when those requests come in. And the best advice, and it's not my advice, it's legal advice. It's if the police have a legal right to be present where they are, to write a report, then they have a legal right to have their camera activated using, of course, awareness of sensitive issues of juvenile, of victimization, of turning it off. But if you're going to have just a citizen in general request to turn it off, I think most of the policies we deal with have to have extenuating circumstances. And I actually believe this won't be any more of an issue in the future. I just think it's becoming embraced that all police are going to have body-worn camera at some point. I don't know that as a fact, but I think that perception is there in the public.
Okay, I've got another one here. This is one that's a little provocative, but I'll give it a shot. Given the recent shooting in Wisconsin, is there enough evidence to suggest a national mandate for officers to wear body-worn cameras? Who wants to take that one?
I'll
Yeah,
start. So
go
since I
ahead.
know, yeah, so Kenosha, I've actually done some work as a subject matter expert with, and it's affected the jurisdiction that I worked in, Madison. There were riots last night. I think that this is just my own personal perception, that the police should want more, want to welcome it. I know Madison itself, the agency I work for, was resisted because of privacy issues with body-worn camera, is resisted. But I don't know if there's going to be any more examples, whether it's Kenosha or another incident, where the benefits of having body-worn camera will prove beneficial for not only the police, but the community as well, from my take. It is a tough question to answer, but I think yes.
It is
Okay.
tough. And Canada just did this. They just made a national mandate for all police departments to wear body-worn cameras. It's a much different context than the United States. I know I sound like a broken record here, but 18,000 departments, ranging from 1 or 2 officer departments all the way up to the NYPD. For us to get a national mandate on anything seems a little bit inane because of just the pure difference between departments. And then you have to think of cost. We haven't mentioned cost much, but to implement body-worn cameras in some departments just wouldn't make any fiscal sense. And you'd certainly have to get federal support or state support or local support that would allow them to do so. So it's a really difficult question. I would say I'm always supportive of guidance. I think there could be federal guidance, but a federal mandate when you have 18,000 departments, that's a tough one.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'd be too difficult to mandate and then to implement. It'd be an unfunded mandate essentially too, because of the costs. So I doubt that it would happen. I don't think that the feds would actually do that. Okay, the last question I have is, while survey and study results reveal positive findings about police and civilian attitudes about BWCs, do you think there is a negative undercurrent regarding BWCs in policing? Maybe from unions, maybe from hardcore activists. Is there a negative undercurrent regarding BWCs in policing? Anything? What do you think? That's a hard one too.
In my experience, there hasn't been a lot of research on this per se. So this is just more on the current that we're hearing from departments and also what's being in the press and what we're hearing from activist groups and policymakers. I'm actually seeing unions become more and more supportive. When we first started this work, trying to get unions to sign on to body-worn camera programs was sometimes very difficult. And I'm not seeing nearly the pushback from the police associations now, at least again, in my experience. However, the tables have turned where now it's the activist organizations, the ACLUs, some of the like, or in the questions, the hardcore naysayers are saying, and I think their fear is that everyone is expecting body-worn cameras to alleviate the problem, and it's not, or at least what they perceive to be the transparency and accountability problem, and they're not. So it is funny how the tables have turned. Unions are becoming more supportive, and some of these social justice activist groups are becoming less supportive.
Yeah, just quickly, Craig, I'll echo that. It's we've touched on it already throughout this, and I think it depends upon perspectives. Like, you can even compare a little bit to like less lethal munitions. The purpose of those is to cause less deadly force encounters. But even some people are against that, the use of less lethal, because of the perception. I think overall we are definitely seeing, I've had police union presidents ask me to talk to the union about the benefits of body-worn camera for the officers. I think we're seeing more and more on both sides, police and the community, of recognizing the value.
Okay, terrific. Okay, we are out of time. I want to thank you both for your participation in the panel. I want to thank the audience for paying attention, and I'm going to turn it over to Carrie. Carrie, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Uchida. Thank you, Dr. Mom, and thank you, Lieutenant Woodmansee, for a wonderful presentation on body-worn camera research, where the field is at. I really especially appreciate it, and I hope our audience does too, how you brought it down to the level of what that research means for police departments, police agencies across the nation, how they can use it, how they can implement it. You know, especially if they want to do research on their own, how we can support them in doing so. So thank you for that excellent presentation. Definitely appreciate your time and your wisdom that and all the effort you put into, you know, doing this research and sharing your insight with us.